Hi everybody, thank you for joining me as I continue my review of Timothy Keller's book, The Reason for God, from my atheist perspective. In this video I will cover chapters 2 and 3 of The Reason for God, and we'll begin, naturally enough, with chapter 2, which is titled, How Could a Good God Allow Suffering? The Problem of Evil. Then, this classic philosophical dilemma. How do you reconcile the existence of a benevolent, all-powerful God with the evil and the suffering that we see every day in the world? Evil and suffering in the world can call into question the very existence of God for some, while others will simply see this as a problem preventing them from trusting or loving or worshiping a God that they nonetheless believe exists. Keller brings up the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami, which killed 250,000 people and spread devastation across a huge region of the globe. And in the aftermath of a tragedy of this proportion, people openly wondered where God had been in all of this, and how anyone could believe that there was a good, loving God watching over us, protecting us, interested in our lives, caring about us, when we are faced with such horror, and especially on such an incredible magnitude as that tsunami, or many other natural disasters, the Haiti earthquake. There are so many just incredibly devastating natural disasters just within the last few years that you could make this exact same argument about. But, Keller argues, the existence of evil and of suffering in the world is not evidence against God. Keller's argument is that the evil and suffering in the world may seem pointless to us, but just because we can't imagine a good reason for God to allow such things to happen, that doesn't mean that there isn't one. Keller says, quote, "Again, we see lurking within supposedly hard-nosed skepticism and enormous faith in one's own cognitive faculties. If our minds can't plumb the depths of the universe for good answers to suffering, well, then there can't be any. This is blind faith of a high order." Well, since he chides skeptics for assuming there isn't a good answer to why a benevolent God would allow evil and suffering, one might ask where Keller got the idea that there is such an answer. But I think we know that already. Keller cites Alvin Plantinga and Plantinga's illustration of no-see-ums in the camping tent. He says, quote, "If you look into your pup tent for a St. Bernard and you don't see one, it's reasonable to assume that there is no St. Bernard in your tent. But if you look into your pup tent for a no-see-um, an extremely small insect with a bite out of all proportion to its size, and you don't see any, it is not reasonable to assume they aren't there, because after all, no one can see it." The point being, the good reasons for why a benevolent God tolerates evil might be there, but they might be more like no-see-ums than like St. Bernards. And after all, why should we expect them to be like St. Bernards? They could just as easily be like no-see-ums. Well, the obvious observation to make here is that no-see-ums, also known as biting midges, are real things, and they're actually quite detectable to human senses. You can even find photographs of them on Google if you type in no-see-ums. Even before they bite you, you can see them, you can find them, if you know what you're looking for. If you check your pup tent for no-see-ums and you don't find any, it's actually quite reasonable to conclude that they aren't there, assuming that you've looked properly for them. The real question here is, why are the likes of Keller and Plantinga insisting that there are no-see-ums in our pup tent to begin with? And again, I think we already know the answer to that question. Keller writes about the biblical story of Joseph, how Joseph's brothers sold him into slavery and he suffered in bondage for years despite praying to God for help, but how in the long run it all worked out for Joseph because eventually he became a great leader. And if his character had not been tempered by those years of suffering and hardship, he might not have been so well suited for his eventual role. Keller parallels the story of Joseph rising above his adversity to achieve greatness to the sorts of painful experiences that many people face and survive in their everyday lives, including his own bout with cancer, his wife's long time suffering with Crohn's disease, and a man he once knew in one of his parishes who was nearly blind after being shot in the face. Though most wouldn't say they are grateful for the tragedies they endured, they probably would say they are grateful for the strength that they gained and the lessons they learned from the experience. Keller says, quote, "With time and perspective, most of us can see good reasons for at least some of the tragedy and pain that occurs in life." And this seems to me like nothing more than stating the obvious. We are shaped by our experiences. Some of us are able to survive negative experiences and find ourselves changed by those experiences in positive ways. We're stronger, we're smarter, we're more humble, more sensitive, we're aware of things that we weren't aware of before, etc. But that doesn't mean that there was a good reason for horrible things to happen to us. It means shit happened and we dealt with it. Keller says, quote, "If you have a God great and transcendent enough to be mad at because he hasn't stopped evil and suffering in the world, then you have at the same moment a God great and transcendent enough to have good reasons for allowing it to continue that you can't know. Indeed, you can't have it both ways." No, indeed you can't. If you have a God so great and so transcendent as to surpass human understanding, as Christians often describe their God, then what reason do you have to think that this is a good God? If he can have reasons for doing things that we can never hope to comprehend, why should we trust what he reveals to us about himself in the Bible? Could he not have undetectable methods of deceiving us and his own reasons for doing so that are unknowable to us? We have no frame of reference in which to judge this God. If his ways are truly not our ways, then we have no reason to assume that we know anything about him. There's no way we could ever trust such a God. No way such a God could ever establish that what he had revealed to us as the truth was actually the truth. Either God plays by our rules or he doesn't. Either God is comprehensible to us or he's not. You can't have it both ways. Speaking of having it both ways, did you catch how in the midst of telling us that God is great enough to have a reason for allowing evil that we can't know, Keller told us the reason? Or at least one of the reasons, and that reason is that suffering builds character. We've all heard this before. And I've never been very impressed by this argument. God allows us to suffer because it makes us better people. Too bad, then, that we are not all Josephs. We don't all endure and rise above and achieve greatness tempered by the brutal circumstances from which we emerged. A lot of us just experience agony without relief or redemption. Not everyone gets to rebuild their ruined life. A lot of us just struggle on in the ruins the best we can until we succumb to despair or exhaustion and die. Life isn't a drama, and we don't all get satisfying character arcs. Many of us are not strengthened or purified by our suffering. We're destroyed by it. And suppose you did suffer, and suppose your suffering came to an end, and then you met someone who told you that he had watched the entirety of your suffering. He had watched it all without intervening, and he had the power to intervene and to end your suffering at any time, and he did nothing. And he had done this for your own good, because he knew it would make you a stronger, better person. Would your reaction be to thank this person? Would you regard him as a good person? Would you feel compelled to defend him and make excuses for his behavior if other people questioned his benevolence? Maybe if he was a doctor and he had to break an improperly healed bone in order for it to heal correctly, maybe something like that, if it was for a true need. But wouldn't you know that the entire time? Wouldn't you be informed that this is what was happening? God doesn't do that. God doesn't come down and reassure you personally, hey, I know that you're going through some rough stuff right now, but it's all going to be for a good end. You're going to come out of this much stronger and much better and much more able to take on the world. He doesn't say that. He allows us, if he's there, he allows us to suffer in despair. And the excuse is, well, when you get to the end, if you do get to the end in one piece, you'll be better for it. I would not want to embrace that person if I met them at the end of my suffering. Keller cites C.S. Lewis and his argument that the existence of evil and our natural revulsion at it should actually be considered evidence in favor of a benevolent God. He says, quote, "On what basis, then, does the atheist judge the natural world to be horribly wrong, unfair, and unjust? The non-believer in God doesn't have a good basis for being outraged at injustice, which, as Lewis points out, was the reason for objecting to God in the first place." The moral argument, in other words. You're offended by the evil God allows. But how do you judge what's evil in the first place? Checkmate, atheist. Also, I would just point out as well that I don't consider, and I know a lot of atheists don't consider the natural world, as in weather patterns and the actions of animals, etc., to be wrong or unjust. Those don't really have a moral dimension. It's only when something horrible happens to an innocent person that is supposedly under the protection of God that that problem enters. The natural world, in general, the universe, doesn't really have a moral dimension. The universe isn't unjust or unfair or uncaring. These are just ways we use to describe it. It's not quite that way. An animal, a lion that tears apart an antelope, isn't being cruel. But anyway, to answer Keller's question, an atheist might, and I say might because there isn't a single code of ethics that atheists are all obliged to follow, but an atheist might judge something to be wrong, unfair, or unjust on the basis of empathy, on the basis of a feeling of solidarity with his fellow humans, or perhaps more broadly with his fellow creatures. An atheist might be outraged at a perceived injustice because he wouldn't wish to find himself or someone he cares about in a similar situation, or because he cares about the overall welfare of his community and believes no society can thrive while it tolerates injustice and unfair treatment of some of its members. Keller and Lewis, who he cites, are also assuming that if there is an objective standard of morality, it must come from the God they believe in. Now, personally, I think that human morality is ultimately of human origin, and that there are no ultimately objective standards, and that things are good or bad because we have defined them as such. I don't believe there's an objective moral reality. But not every atheist agrees with me. Some people who don't believe in God believe in objective moral standards that exist apart from us and our culture and our ideas. Regardless of where we think they came from, atheists do have moral standards the same as everyone else has them. And it is to those very standards which we appeal when we look at the suffering in the world and decide that the concept of an all-powerful and benevolent God, in the face of that suffering, the God that Christians are always talking about, just doesn't make sense. We are judging God, as Christians describe him, according to our standard of how a powerful person ought to respond to needless suffering and injustice, and finding that he comes up well short of that standard. That's not evidence for the God, that's evidence for the standard. Next, Keller addresses those who suffer without apparent positive result, the people I was talking about a few minutes ago, the non-Josephs of the world, which is most of us. What about those clouds that have no silver lining? Well, Keller advises that in these cases, while Christianity may not be able to explain why such horrible things are allowed to happen, it can help us to face the pain that results from these things with hope and courage. Keller talks about Jesus and how Jesus suffered and was crucified on the cross, and how he experienced great physical and emotional pain on the way to his death. Many later martyrs faced their deaths with much more outward bravery than that we see Jesus displaying as he is led to the cross in the Gospels. And why is this? Well, this Keller says, is because Jesus' sufferings were so much more inconceivable than anything suffered by the martyrs or by anyone else. And the worst part of the suffering of Christ was experiencing the total separation from God, that is, the punishment for all sinners. On the cross, Jesus experienced suffering and rejection beyond all human experience. Quote, "So, if we embrace the Christian teaching that Jesus is God and that he went to the cross, then we have deep consolation and strength to face the brutal realities of life on earth. We can know that God is truly Emmanuel, God with us, even in our worst sufferings." Except we can't know that because there's no evidence that it's anything other than a story people tell. One of the only consolations for people who must endure suffering that they're powerless to stop is to know that they aren't alone, that there are others who understand what they're going through. I agree with Keller there. But it's less consoling when the person who is with you in your suffering is also the person who has the power to end that suffering at any time and doesn't. The fact that God has supposedly suffered himself doesn't make it any better. In fact, to me, it actually makes it worse. To allow a person to needlessly suffer when you yourself have first-hand experience of their agony is unconscionable to me. But there I go again, assuming that it's needless. I really just need to abandon that baseless faith position that God doesn't have a good reason for allowing suffering. And instead what I need to do is embrace the position that God must have some reason, even if that position is equally baseless and faith-based, because that one's better for some reason. Finally, Keller gets around to talking about the redemption believers can have through Christ. Christianity tells us that for those who have accepted Christ, their suffering is not in vain. They have a new heaven and a new earth waiting for them, a paradise, a perfected world to look forward to. He says, quote, "The biblical view of things is resurrection, not a future that is just a consolation for the life we never had, but a restoration of the life you always wanted. This means that every horrible thing that ever happened will not only be undone and repaired, but will in some way make the eventual glory and joy even greater." It was smart on Keller's part to put this bit at the end of the chapter, because you don't want to open with the deranged wish thinking. That makes you look weak. Though opening with God's reasons for allowing suffering are beyond our understanding, and then spending the rest of the chapter discussing several of those reasons might not have been the best way to go either. But, what are you going to do? This last bit, the "it'll all work out fine" in the end bit, troubles me even more than the rest of this chapter, because I see it as an unserious attempt to solve a deeply serious problem. And religion does this a lot, and it really bothers me. How do we make sense of suffering in the world? What do we say to a mother whose child drowned in a flood? What do we say to a man who lies in a hospital bed dying in agony from cancer? How do we make sense of death and destruction that has happened for no sensible reason? These are serious, unavoidable questions that we all have to face at some point. Eventually, we will all be the person who suffers the loss, or we will all be faced with the responsibility of comforting that person. And what should we do? What should we say? Well, to say, "Oh, don't worry, all of this will eventually work for the good," in the absence of any evidence suggesting that is actually true, is cowardly and childish and ignorant and cruel. To say all this evil and suffering will be defeated someday and then we'll all live forever in happiness and peace is to deny that there's even anything to worry about. It's a tacit admission that we have nothing useful to say, no idea what we can do to help, so let's all just imagine that things are actually okay. I'm not saying that there are easy satisfying answers to any of these questions. And I'm not saying that there is a right thing to do in difficult situations. There probably isn't. That's what makes them so difficult. I am saying that to pretend there are answers when we don't know that there are, or worse yet, to pretend that we know what those answers are, is arrogant and foolish and wrong. Keller focuses on the evils that we experience and that we hear about in our everyday lives for this chapter, and typically this has been the focus when people consider the problem of evil. It's evil in the world. How can God tolerate earthquakes and floods and disease and things that seem to take people for no reason and inflict suffering on people for no reason, completely out of their control? But I think that a much better question is, how could a good God do the evil things that he does in the Bible? It's one thing to excuse God for tolerating the suffering that befalls others as a result of natural disasters or even human violence, but it's quite another to excuse God for the horrific crimes he himself commits or commands others to commit in the Old Testament. There are divinely wrought evils in the New Testament as well, particularly the wicked proposition of salvation through the scapegoating of Jesus, but I've been there before and I'll get there again eventually. Before we ask Christians to explain how a good God could allow people to drown in a flood, maybe we should ask them to explain how a good God could personally cause the drowning of virtually the entire population of Earth, as many of them who have a literal interpretation of the Bible believe he did. Or kill the firstborn infants of Egypt. Or order his followers to wage a genocidal war against members of another tribe. The answers typically proposed to these questions aren't that different from those Keller offers in this chapter, so it's really just as well. Their answers are things like, well, his ways are not our ways, or any suffering on this world is redeemed by the paradise waiting in the next. We've heard these arguments before, probably. But to me, the best answer to the problem of evil, whether we're talking about the Bible or the natural world, it's the same answer that I gave at the end of the previous video in this series. There's no problem reconciling a benevolent God with the suffering we find in the Bible or in the world in general, because there's no reason to think that God or any other God, benevolent or otherwise, exists in the first place. Moving on now to chapter 3, which is titled Christianity is a Straitjacket. Keller opens the chapter this way. He says, quote, "Is a belief in absolute truth the enemy of freedom? Most people I've met in New York City believe that it is. Christianity names some beliefs heresy and some practices immoral. It bars from its community those who transgress its doctrinal and moral boundaries. This seems to contemporary observers to endanger civic freedom because it divides rather than unites our population." Well, it only endangers civic freedom to the extent that Christians are successful in forcing people outside their church to stay within their boundaries. Christians and members of other religious communities ought to be free to draw whatever doctrinal and moral boundaries they want, so long as they don't break the law or insist that those outside their communities be bound by their doctrines and morality. Keller counters this claim that Christianity is the enemy of community and even of freedom itself by arguing that it is based on misunderstandings of the concepts of truth, community, Christianity, and liberty. First, truth. Keller argues that the concept of truth held by many modern people is influenced by Michel Foucault, who connected truth with power. Someone who makes a truth claim is trying to control other people. But this is untenable, Keller says, because if all truth claims are power plays, then so is the claim that all truth claims are power plays. The Roadrunner tactic! Back again. Likewise, if you claim, as Freud did, that all truth claims about God are just projections of our own guilt and insecurity, then that claim itself must be evidence of guilt and insecurity. Double Roadrunner tactic. He's a super duper genius. The inevitable conclusion, Keller says, is that some truth claims must be true. Not power plays, not projections, but actually true. Otherwise, the very concept of truth collapses in inconsistency and contradiction. Well, I might say, so what if it does? Not to treat the matter too lightly, because I think it's an important and fascinating subject, but why does Keller assume that just because a concept of truth seems to become inconsistent when taken to an absurd extreme, it is an invalid way of conceiving truth? My own concept of truth is pretty mundane and empirical. If it agrees with reality, it's true. If it contradicts reality, it's false. But even this concept of truth gets complicated when we zoom in close enough. How do we determine what corresponds to reality and what doesn't? Sometimes it seems obvious and sometimes not so much. And no matter how we try to argue our way out of it, we are all imprisoned inescapably by our senses. Ultimately, even reason itself can be shown to be circular. And how are we to make judgments about which truth claims to accept and which to reject if not by our reason? The point is, Keller can reject modern concepts of truth popularized by Foucault or Nietzsche or Freud because he finds them ultimately inconsistent and self-defeating if he wants to do that. He doesn't have to discuss them. He doesn't have to put any effort into trying to understand why these various writers and philosophers were attracted to these concepts to begin with. He can just say, nope, it's inconsistent, and throw them out the window without even dealing with them if that's what he wants to do. But let's at least be honest enough to admit that everything we have learned through our senses and understood through our reason can be reduced to absurdity in just the same way. Truth, reason, perception, these are complicated things, no matter how simple we try to make them. And in a discussion like this about the nature of truth, it's no use to pretend otherwise. The problem with Christianity's truth claims isn't that they're absolute. It's that there are no good reasons to accept them as being any more true than the truth claims of any other religion. Keller moves on to community. Christianity is charged with being contrary to the spirit of community because it requires Christians to hold certain beliefs and to abide by certain moral standards. But this uniformity of belief and morality is not necessary for a strong community, critics supposedly say, according to Keller. All that is needed is respect for privacy and individual rights and equal opportunities for education, jobs, and participation in the political process. And Keller calls this view of the community as a liberal democracy simplistic. He says, quote, every human community holds in common some beliefs that necessarily create boundaries, including some people and excluding others from its circle. And Keller is right, of course. All communities, no matter how pluralistic and inclusive they try to be, have some standards and shared values that define them as a community, however broadly. He goes on to say that we should criticize Christians who condemn unbelievers and treat them ungraciously, but not those who merely maintain standards in accordance with their beliefs. But as he did when he was writing about truth a moment ago, Keller, either innocently or willfully, ignores the far more common objection. Most critics of Christianity who criticize it for being intolerant and exclusive aren't complaining about the presence of standards, but rather about the standards that are present. See that? I can spin bullshit rhetoric with the best of them. They also criticize the effort of many Christians to impose their standards on the whole of society, as I mentioned before, and they criticize these standards themselves for appearing to be arbitrary and capricious rather than rooted in any good reasoning. Keller then argues that Christianity is not a cultural straitjacket. It does not, as critics allege, forcibly homogenize people from diverse backgrounds. Instead, Keller claims, Christianity has shown itself to be more adaptive of diverse cultures than secularism. Keller compares Christianity to other world religions. The Islamic population remains largely centered on the Middle East, where that religion originated. Likewise, Hinduism, Buddhism, Confucianism all have their demographic centers in the parts of the world where they first arose. Christianity, on the other hand, has gone from a Jewish-dominated Middle Eastern religion to a Hellenistic Mediterranean religion, to a largely Northern European religion, to a largely Western European and North American religion, to today, when most Christians in the world live in Africa, Latin America, and Asia, far from the region where Christianity originated. Well, that's not due to the inclusivity of Christianity, Tim. That's due to something called conquest. Colonialism. It's the same reason English and Spanish are such commonly spoken languages in the world. I wonder if you could travel back in time and ask the indigenous people of North or South America who were told by European Christians what to believe, how to dress, by what standard they ought to conduct themselves, what they thought of Christianity, would they describe it as respecting, preserving, and adapting to their native culture? I wonder what they would say. The ones who were forcibly converted rather than killed, of course. Keller seems to think that the fact that the population center of Christianity has shifted so many times throughout its history is indicative of what an adaptable and inclusive faith it is. I think it's actually indicative of the fact that it was the official religion of most of Europe during an era of aggressive colonial expansion. Keller then touts the diversity of his own church, Redeemer Presbyterian Church of Manhattan. His church embraces urban life, including the arts, racial diversity, and efforts to ensure social justice for all people. And I say that is great. All of that is great. I applaud Keller for it. Good on you, Tim, for leading such an inclusive, tolerant, community-minded church. Timothy Keller, good on you! Of course, my applause is muted somewhat by how much space Keller devotes to shamelessly tooting his own horn. I had to tap my Kindle 5 times before he finally got on to something else. And it went something like this. People have been shocked at how fast my church grew. They all ask what the secret is, why so many thousands of people are flocking to my church. My church is so diverse. All different kinds of people come to it, including John DeLorean, well, not anymore, I guess, and a speechwriter for a Republican presidential candidate, and a songwriter for Madonna. And this one time, a man from the southern U.S. visited my church and wanted to know how we attracted all these people without flashy presentations and hip modern music. And I said it was because my church wasn't pompous and full of itself like other churches. The people who come to my church are intelligent, sensitive, and most of all, humble. I'm paraphrasing, of course, to make Keller sound like even more of an asshole than he comes across as in the actual book. But those of you who are following along with me will note that I didn't have to change all that much. Now onto the subject of freedom. Freedom, unlike truth, apparently, isn't simple, Keller says. Sometimes, as in the case of a musically inclined person who submits him or herself to years of piano lessons, restriction of freedom can lead to liberation. Quote, in many areas of life, freedom is not so much the absence of restrictions as finding the right ones, the liberating restrictions. Instead of insisting on freedom to create spiritual reality, shouldn't we be seeking to discover it and disciplining ourselves to live according to it? Tell you what, when you discover the tiniest trace of verifiable spiritual reality, you let me know, okay? And if that happens, after you discover the tiniest trace of that spiritual reality, if you then also discover some compelling reason why I should live my life according to it, you let me know that too, okay? My ears are open. Keller takes this concept of liberating restrictions into the realm of morality. He says, quote, the popular concept that we should each determine our own morality is based on the belief that the spiritual realm is nothing at all like the rest of the world. Okay, a few thoughts. A, no it isn't. And B, is it really that popular of a concept? I believe morality is a human invention, but that doesn't mean that I think we as individuals do or should determine our own morality. Moral standards exist outside ourselves as individuals. I just don't think that there is some kind of objective moral reality that exists apart from the moral concepts invented and used by us and by other moral beings, whoever they might be. And of course, as I said earlier, not all atheists agree with me. I do play a role in determining my morality. I make moral judgments. I accept certain standards and reject others. But that's no different than what anyone else does, whatever their religious beliefs, so far as I can tell. We all judge what morals make sense to us and what morals don't, whether you're a Christian or a Jew or an atheist or whatever. So, let's just assume, since Keller does, that there is a moral spiritual reality, and that in order to thrive, we must acknowledge this reality. What is this reality? Keller tells us what it is. Quote, love. Love is the most liberating freedom loss of all. And perhaps that is true, but in what way is love a moral spiritual reality? Keller describes a healthy love relationship, how those involved must each lose some independence, because if only one party does all the sacrificing for the other, then the relationship will be out of balance. It will not be healthy for both people. How then can a relationship with God be anything but exploitative and dehumanizing? Well, Keller has anticipated this objection. To him, it's easy. It's not a one-way relationship. God has adjusted to us. Quote, in the most profound way, God has said to us in Christ, I will adjust to you. I will change for you. I'll serve you, though it means a sacrifice for me. When I think about the changes and the sacrifices that God makes for me in Christianity, I imagine him saying something a little more like this. I'll do this once through a bloody act of human sacrifice, and I'll leave behind no evidence to assure future generations that I've done it, just the contradictory second and third hand, at best, accounts of a few members of my cult, which won't actually be written down until decades after the fact. Also, not everyone will benefit from this adjustment. Only those of you who not only hear about it and believe that it actually happened on the basis of that terribly unpersuasive non-evidence, but also implicate yourselves in the sacrifice by accepting that it was done partially in your name. Everyone who doesn't do that will suffer unimaginable torments after they die forever. Oh, and one more thing. The sacrifice I'm making for you is temporary at best and mostly just ceremonial, since I'm never actually dead from my perspective, and my sufferings amount to a momentary inconvenience in the existence of an eternal, all-powerful God, and I ultimately lose nothing. So yeah, can you believe that I'm going to do all that for you? And all I ask in return is an eternity of worship and unswerving obedience. Good deal, right? Well, anyway, that's it for this video. That's it for Chapter 3. I will be back in the next video in this series to take on Chapter 4, which is titled, The Church is Responsible for So Much Injustice, and Chapter 5, How Can a Loving God Send People to Hell? Sounds like promising stuff. So I will be back in the next video in the series to review those chapters. Thank you guys so much for watching. I truly, truly appreciate your interest in this and the fact that you watch these videos and share them and talk about them. Please, please, please feel free to leave a comment on this video about anything you've seen here. Those of you who are philosophers or philosophy students who have tread these deep waters, you can probably tell that I'm a little out of my depth when I get into the philosophy stuff. It's not really my bag. So I'm sure that I fucked some things up. I'm sure that I could have said things better. I said some things that you think are wrong or whatever. Please feel free to engage, to argue, to correct, to try to explain things better, to point out where I got something wrong or where I could have said something better. I'm completely open to that. It's a learning experience for me as well as for anybody who might be watching. So And if, of course, if you're a Christian and you watch this and it's of interest to you and you think I've said something that's wrong or unfair, or you think I've made a good point or whatever, please, I'd love to hear what you have to say. So comment on the video, let me know what you're thinking. I love to read all the responses, and I will see you guys in the next video in the series.